Welcome to Libeth. I'm glad you're here. This week we are in late Heian, Japan, with the Heike Monogatari, compiled by anonymous Biwa Hoshi and later expanded by Kakuichi. The tale begins with a bell that does not simply toll. The narrative insists that the bell's sound dissolves itself. That image arrives like a law rather than a metaphor, and it sets how the story will breathe. The sound of Jinshoja's bell, the color of Sala blossoms, the fleeting foam on the sea. Those images do more than illustrate loss. They make impermanence the ground under every action, so that a single victory at the top of power sits on the same thin shelf as the last leaf clinging to a branch. The tale speaks as if everything visible already leans toward its own vanishing, and the first gesture of the book is to place that tilt at the center of human affairs. If impermanence is a ground, then Terra no Kiyomori's trajectory becomes its experiment. He rises so steadily you taste the certainty of his triumph. A merchant family married into the court, a ruthless appetite for rank, a daughter elevated to the imperial household, a court that bends around his will. The text follows him not as biography but as demonstration. See how power concentrates and how, by concentrating, it displays the shape of its own loss. Kiyomori's ceremonies, his banquets, the long corridors of the palace echo as if designed to show the splendor that cannot stay. When the tale lingers on his triumphs, it does not celebrate. It suspends them like glass bulbs that will inevitably shatter, so that his peak already contains the image of falling. That unfolding of a single life becomes a law when the book shifts from one household to a nation at war. War in the Heike is not an arena where greatness proves itself and lingers. War is the lever that reveals instability. The Genpei clashes move like a tide line that pulls back to show what the land looked like before anyone claimed it. Combat scenes where names are etched in light, the single combats, the banners snapping, occur right beside images of ruined houses, burned temples, and exiled women rowing under cold skies. The contrast is intentional. A clash may create a hero for a moment, but it also exposes the thin membrane that keeps society on its feet. The story uses the spectacle of battle to show that everything spectacular sits atop failure. That use of spectacle makes room for a peculiar aestheticization of death. The episode of Atsumori and Kumagai offers this as a knife and a mirror at once. The tale slows to a hush when it follows the young Atsumori, whose life the narrative dresses in music, a courtly youth who played the flute, and then places him in the mud of combat. Kumagai, a warrior hardened by war, recognizes in the youth's face a lost world of refinement and sees a reflection of mortality that does not match the posture of battle. When Kumagai cleaves, the action reads like ritual. The sound of the flute before the blade, the ordinary human detail of a sword that catches the light, the aftermath where the killer finds himself staring at the body and at his own hands. The scene refuses heroic closure. It produces a sorrow that sits awkwardly beside the claims of honor and victory. That awkward sorrow does not vanish into private conscience because the tale insists on public reckoning. Kumagai's remorse turns into a visible change. He becomes a monk, he prays over the remains, he seeks absolution in chants. The narrative does not simply moralize, it traces the displacement of violence into ritual. What the battlefield could not resolve, the temple tries to contain. That displacement reveals how war's effects migrate from immediate act into long chains of memory and ceremony, so that a single duel ripples outward and becomes a practice for dealing with transience. The book thus makes remorse structural, not incidental, turning private grief into the grammar of collective response. If a duel channels sorrow into ritual, Danara collapses ritual back into catastrophe. The sea in that account does what the bell did at the opening. It swallows sound and sight. The Terra fleet, the imperial boat with the young Emperor Antoku, the offering of the sacred regalia, all of this dissolves in the brine, and the water becomes the judge that refuses narratives of triumph. The tide does not choose sides. It insists on leveling. The imperial child goes down with the symbols of authority, and the book frames that moment as a cosmic comment. The instruments of power drown alongside the bodies that carried them. The sea converts political hierarchy into the undifferentiated sorrow of loss. That conversion demands the story treat victory with suspicion. A triumph that costs the lives of many, that ends in drowned emperors and ruined clans, cannot remain a triumph. The Heike redirects our attention from banners and lists of slain to the lingering aftermath. Widows binding their hair in mourning, orphaned children learning to say the names of lost fathers, the abandoned estates where weeds claim tatami mats. Victory, in this narrative, looks not like the climax of a poem, but like a stain that refuses to dry. The glory that war promises slips into the book's texture as grief, and that shift demonstrates a larger argument. Power is not only temporary, it is porous to suffering and thus always already compromised. That porousness shows up in how the tale places particular scenes as anchors for memory. Storytellers, the Biwa Hoshi, chose certain images to repeat. The bell, the tide, the flute, the head of a warrior laid on a pole. These motifs travel through retellings, and in doing so, shape how the conflict is remembered. Memory here is not neutral. It selects the lines that make the narrative hold together. The heaviest name-bearing heroes survive in song because their details lend themselves to music and gesture. Those who do not fit the pattern of aesthetic recollection vanish into the margins. The process by which certain moments become emblematic and others evaporate shows that collective memory is sculpted as much by performative needs as by accuracy. That sculpting involves choices about honor and shame. The Heike often concentrates on the elite, the samurai families, the imperial line, while the many who died anonymously remain a fog behind the named actors. This focus does not simply reflect the social reality of the period. It creates a particular kind of moral geography. When the tale describes a named warrior's fall, the story stops and deciphers meaning. When a nameless soldier dies, the narration moves on because there is no role for that death in the story of impermanence the tale wants to tell. The selective memory thus reveals its own priorities. It elevates the symbolic at the expense of the unanointed. It converts mass loss into narratives that reinforce certain social values. That conversion becomes intentional when the tale folds historical events into parable. Kiyomori's arrogance becomes a lesson. The Heike does not treat his misdeeds as mere career mistakes. It frames them as moral transgressions with cosmic consequence. The narrative repeatedly notes his pride, his disrespect for older aristocratic rituals, his attempt to rewrite rank. Those details do not simply chronicle ambition. They map a cause-and-effect story where overreach produces downfall. The book calibrates authority so that hubris becomes a cause of collapse, and in that move, it makes history into an ethical argument. But the ethical argument sits awkwardly with the aesthetic image-making, because the tale will also show exquisite scenes of human pain without always offering clean moral closure. That tension between moral lesson and aesthetic spectacle shows up in the way death is narrated. When children drown at Danara, when mothers bury themselves in fire, the language morphs between flat reportage and graceful poetry. That form reveals the tale's deeper insistence. Beauty and horror can coexist because both reveal the truth of transience. A musical phrasing around a corpse makes us feel the vanishing more keenly. Yet those same ornate phrases risk turning misery into art. The Heike uses aestheticization to make transience perceivable, and in doing so it creates an ethical friction. The beauty of the description honors the dead and potentially commodifies them at the same time. That friction shows most clearly in the story's concern with names. The Heike enumerates warriors and their lineages with painstaking care. To be named is to be remembered. To be remembered is to be salvaged from the sea of forgetting. At the same time, the book's focus on naming reveals its partiality. Those who fit genealogies and courtly networks are preserved. The story thus builds a memory economy where social recognition buys a measure of posthumous permanence. But the narrative keeps reminding us that even a well-documented name will not withstand time. The bell continues to toll, and names fade as naturally as faces in water. The ritual of naming both asserts importance and demonstrates failure. That rituality travels outward from the aristocratic to the popular. The Biwa-hoshi perform the Heike as a ritual that transforms raw events into a story the community can bear. They compress months of fighting into scenes, they amplify certain speeches, they accent certain gestures. In doing so, they create a shared map of the past that people can inhabit. But the map is not a faithful copy. It is a lived object shaped by audiences' needs, by the patronage of temples and courthouses, by the constraints of music and memory. The tale, therefore, becomes an archive of feeling as much as of fact, and the archive itself starts to affect future action because people remember in ways that guide their choices. That guidance can look like consolation or like control. On one hand, ritualized retelling helps communities process grief. A woman who hears the story of a fallen son finds in it the language for sorrow. A village adopts a chant that lets them mark anniversaries. On the other hand, the same retelling can legitimate reigning powers by providing narratives that frame past rebellion or conquest as inevitable. The Heike is ambiguous on that front. Sometimes it elevates the Terra as tragic victims. At other times, it frames their fall as karmic retribution. That ambiguity means the text functions both as therapy and as instrument, and the consequence is that memory remains contested even when it feels rehearsed. That contestation plays out in specific episodes where public policies and private grief collide. Consider Kiyomori ordering the banishment of political rivals and pushing his daughter into the imperial household. The book describes these moves with bureaucratic detail and with grotesque human costs. Rival families driven into exile, children separated from mothers, houses burned for face saving. Those bureaucratic acts read like the mechanics of power, and they make clear how impersonal structures manufacture personal wounds. The narrative pushes us to see that a state's decisions are not abstract causes. They move through kitchens, through arms, through beds, and they generate the intimate scenes of mourning that supply the tale's emotional charge. That observation reframes common notions of heroism. The Heike does not let heroism stand cleanly as virtue. Acknowledge the skill of a mounted archer or the bravery of a man who stands alone against 5 enemies, and the tale will immediately show the aftermath. A wife widowed, fields left fallow, a house empty on the winter mornings. The text thus forces us to view heroism as a transactional event. It achieves reputation, but also extracts a toll in other lives. That calculus undercuts the glamour of individual exploits and redirects our attention to networks of obligation and suffering that outlast a single act. That networked sense of cost appears in the book's repeated images of family lines unthreading. Children who inherit titles find themselves hostages to luck. Great houses lose sons in a single title sweep and see their fortunes collapse. The Heike follows genealogies like filaments, showing how one death pulls an entire fabric apart. The narrative does not allow us to isolate a brave deed from its familial repercussions. Instead, it maps the ripple outward so that each hero also becomes the source of future vulnerability. This mapping deepens the book's central point. Power has a temporal fragility because it rests on human lives that can vanish unexpectedly. That fragility sits uneasily with the book's rhetorical desire to make sense of causation. The Heike offers reasons, divine retribution, karmic cycles, human folly, but none of them close the loop. The text presents these explanations not as definitive verdicts, but as interpretive frames that help listeners cope. Kiyomori's ambition becomes both a moral cause and a sign of epical change. His family's loss reads as individual misfortune and structural collapse. The tale, therefore, leaves explanation open-ended, refusing to let readers settle into a single moral. This refusal keeps the narrative alive because it forces ongoing interpretation. Yet it also means memory will be contested because no single account lays absolute claim to truth. That openness emerges in how the Heike treats time inside the story. The narrative expands and contracts with memory. A battle scene might be stretched into a long elegy. A political appointment might be passed over in a few clipped lines. The effect is that events that support the tale's themes gain weight, while others do not. Time itself becomes selective. When the tale wants to teach about transience, it slows to let the listener feel it. When it wants to trace the machinery of power, it accelerates, showing piles of acts building toward a tipping point. This modulation makes the story itself a model of the temporality it proclaims. Elements linger until they must vanish and vanish when they must imprint. That modeling is not neutral for historical knowledge. A scholar reading the Heike will always find evidence and the absence of evidence, and both are meaningful. The presence of ornate episodes suggests patterns that were culturally salient. The gaps invite questions about whose stories were suppressed by performance constraints. The narrative's form thus directs what will survive historically, and in that sense, the Heike acts as an engine of cultural memory, not merely a passive record. The text not only reports what happened, it shapes how future generations will imagine what happened. That shaping often operates through the story's moral language. The Heike frequently pairs cause and consequence in moral sequences. Arrogance leads to calamity, compassion leads to spiritual release. But those pairings complicate rather than simplify moral judgment, because characters who perform noble acts also suffer or fail. Kumagai kills a youth and then becomes a monk. Kiyomori attains rank but loses his line. The pairing therefore pushes beyond simple retribution and insists on moral ambivalence. The tale suggests that ethical life will mix acts that cannot be reconciled within a single moral economy, and the narrative management of that mix becomes the cultural lesson. That lesson intersects with ritual practice when the story circulates in temples and palaces. The Heike sits in spaces where memory gets institutionalized. Memorial services, recitations, visual arts. These institutional frames stabilize certain interpretations and make them repeatable. A temple that sponsors recitations helps propagate a version of the story that fits the temple's theology and social position. Over time, the repeated version takes on the authority of history itself. The institutionalization of the tale converts memory into tradition, and tradition lends the myth an air of inevitability. That air of inevitability is both consoling and dangerous. It consoles by offering a narrative arc, rise, hubris, fall, repentance, that gives meaning to chaos. It warns by flattening alternative experiences into a canonical lesson that may absolve contemporary power holders or stigmatize the vanquished. The Heike's authority, therefore, is not simply cultural warmth or literary mastery. It is political leverage. When communities tell the tale, they not only remember, they rehearse models of governance, of loyalty, of punishment. The practice of remembering becomes an act of shaping the future as much as preserving the past. That shaping returns us to the central paradox the tale insists upon. War is not the origin, but the manifestation of impermanence. The story never treats military conflict as an isolated phenomenon with its own rules. It treats war as the moment when the fragility embedded in social and familial life becomes visible in a brutal, accelerated form. A duel like Atsumori's compresses the whole cultural economy of courtly refinement and martial obligation into a few agonized seconds. A naval disaster like Danara makes the political order dissolve into water. Thus, battles function as acute symptoms rather than chronic causes. They reveal the underlying illness of transience that the bell pronounced at the outset. That way of seeing makes memories roll both urgent and suspect. Memory must work to keep the human past alive against the tide. Memory must also filter experience into forms that people can hold. The Heike insists that those forms will always be partial, shaped by the needs of song, by patrons' tastes, by ritual capacity. Yet the story also claims that this partiality is necessary because raw experience, the flood of horror, the chaos of loss, cannot be carried without frame. The tale therefore imagines a trade. Preserve meaning at the cost of compressing truth. Compress truth so that meaning survives. That imagined trade yields a final tension that the Heike leaves unresolved. The narrative gives us examples of individual experience that resist retelling. A mother's wail that cannot find adequate words, a man's last breath that refuses heroic gloss, a child's confusion at an empty home. The book returns again and again to scenes that language cannot fix. Those moments cry out for direct recollection, yet the tale insists that recollection must pass through ritual if it is to endure. So we are left with a tension between raw experience, which demands presence, and recollection, which requires form. The Heike does not resolve this. Instead, it holds the tension and lets the listener sit in it, and in that holding the tale performs its deepest work. The tale's final gesture, therefore, is not closure, but continued inhabitants of that tension. It leaves the bell's sound echoing. It leaves the sea's surface broken into images that will recur in performance. and it leaves the moral questions floating without neat answers. That unclosed quality enacts the book's claim. Impermanence cannot be fixed by narrative, but narrative can teach us how to live with the fact that nothing stays. The Heike does not aim to resolve the experience of war into a moral ledger. It aims to make the listener feel how memory and action fold into each other under the rule of transience, and from that feeling to shape future action. That's all for today on Libeth. If you want to follow the whole journey, subscribe, a new book every week.